Hi everyone, and welcome back. In this video I want to talk about graphing and graph relationships, specifically creating professional looking graphs for class or for a lab report. So the first thing that you want to do is that you make the graph big and neat enough to read. So if you're working on a computer, it's easy enough to enlarge the size of it, and it should be neat if you're working on the computer. Make sure the graphs have titles and axis labels. The graph title should be the quantity on the y-axis versus the quantity on the x-axis, such as range versus height, like the lab that we did. Make sure that your axes are labeled with proper units. You're going to put those units in parentheses typically. Choose a scale that fits the data well, and make sure to plot the points correctly. So those 2 points really, if you're using the computer, should be pretty easy. But be careful, sometimes you want to check, because sometimes Google Sheets does some weird stuff and you just need to check to make sure that it actually plotted the data that you wanted it to. Don't connect the dots. It's not a child's game. We're looking for trends. So once you have the data plotted, you want to see, is there a trend in the data, like a linear or quadratic or an inverse trend? And then for lab reports, you want to make sure that the graphs have commentary underneath. So we're going to talk about that too. So here's an example of a good looking graph. You can see that we have a title, position versus time for the toy car at the top. We have axis labels, position and time. They both have units, meters and seconds. All right, and we have measurements on both sets of axes. We also have a trend through the data that we can see here. The equation for that trend is shown here, and the correlation is also shown. So we see all of those things. This is what a professional graph should look like. This is what I'm expecting you to do. Okay, now let's talk about adding commentary. So underneath your graph, you want to talk about, what's this a graph of? What trends exist, if any? And what's the quality of the trend, or how well does it fit the data? So notice what I did here. At the bottom here I said the graph above shows the position of the toy car as a function of the time it was traveling. A polynomial trend existed in the data, and the trend fit the data well with a correlation of 0.9929. This tells us that the car was accelerating. We can see that because the position it covers every second is more than the second before. All right, so this is the kind of thing that I'm looking for in your commentary. Just a couple of sentences that describes what I asked for earlier. What is this a graph of? Is there a trend? What is it? And how well did that trend fit the data? So when you're creating graphs, try to work on making sure that you have all of these elements to make sure that you have an excellent looking graph.